Dumelang Absheni Ralocha Sangmanani Mulweni. My name is Naledi Mfoloe, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the latest edition of the African Diaspora News channel, where we unravel the stories that shape our world and our communities. Now, David Merryman, a 59-year-old Virginia landlord, has been sentenced to 17 years in prison for harassing and defrauding Black tenants in the Hampton areas. Now, David's crimes were not just about financial fraud, they were about systemically preying on vulnerable Black families and exploiting their need for housing and abusing his position of power as a landlord. Now, this man owned more than 60 properties, and his actions have now cost him nearly 2 decades in prison, and rightfully so, right? Now, the crimes David committed are appalling. He targeted low-income Black families, renting out homes in terrible conditions, homes with leaks and mold and holes in the ceilings. And these weren't just poor living conditions, right? These were homes he knew were desperate for repair. But instead of fixing them, he forced tenants to pay outrageous security deposits and other fees, knowing that his tenants had no choice but to pay or else face eviction. Now, David didn't stop there. He stole his tenants' identities to fraudulently collect COVID relief funds that were intended to help those struggling to make ends meet during the pandemic. He forged tenant signatures, illegally obtained government funds, and continued to exploit his renters with full knowledge that they had no other options. And apparently, he even evicted them quickly to bring in new victims, continuously perpetuating his cycle of theft and abuse. Now, this is racism at its core.
This woman had to walk her children down the street to use the toilet because the house she was renting from Dave Merryman did not have a functioning toilet in it.
Mr. Merryman took money away from other individuals that rightly deserved it. You know, there was only a limited amount of funds in the rent relief program, and there was a very high demand. You know, the demand certainly outstripped the supply.
He would initiate this process of racist harassment and intimidation until they either moved themselves out or he would evict them. And in some cases, he would actually sabotage the utilities on his own houses in order to get people out.
Being a Merryman tenant often meant being the subject of physical threats and verbal abuse. Rooted in Merryman's verbal threats were racial slurs and racist intimidation.
It's a man who saw an opportunity to exploit the vulnerability of Black families and took it. But what's even more appalling is the racial harassment these tenants endured. David didn't just scam them financially, he insulted them and also belittled them with racial slurs. I mean, imagine having to live under those conditions, feeling trapped in a cycle of abuse and discrimination with nowhere else to go for help. I mean, I find it deeply disturbing to think that this man who systemically stole from these families was also spewing hatred every chance he got. But it's also a harsh reminder of how racism and exploitation are intertwined, right? Especially in the housing market. And we can't ignore the fact that David's victims were targeted because they were Black, because they were vulnerable, and because they had limited options for housing. This is about a system that allows people like David to thrive on the backs of the most vulnerable in our communities. And the properties David targeted were deliberately located in low-income areas where Black families are often left with few choices. I mean, he took advantage of their desperation, knowing they couldn't just pack up and leave. And in doing so, he further entrenched the cycles of poverty and racism that continue to plow our society. David didn't just steal money. He stole dignity, security, and opportunity. And what's clear from this case is that David's actions were deliberate and calculated. He targeted families with limited means and limited options and used his position to oppress them and try to escape any consequences. But thankfully, justice has been served and David is now facing the consequences of his actions. And while David's conviction is a step in the right direction, I believe that the fight for equality in housing, for racial justice, and for true systemic change is far from over. We have to keep pushing for accountability, for for the dismantling of the system that continue to harm our communities. Now, this isn't just about one man. This is about a society that continues to fail Black people in every aspect of life. What are your thoughts on this? Please, let's continue the conversation in the comment section. And while you're at it, don't forget to give this video